Thank you, Madam President. And before I start, I want to just say how much respect that I have for the two senator authors that have been championing this issue for the past year. You've made some very compassionate arguments, and the good Assemblywoman as well. And so I just want you to know that it's been an honor to serve with you both in my first year in the legislature. Today, I'm going to be speaking in two roles. I'm going to be speaking to you as a pharmacist, and I'm going to be speaking to you as an elected official. But before I could become an elected official, I had to have an occupation. And I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a medical professional. And I rose to the ranks of being a pharmacist and being a leader in a part of our profession called compounding that requires extensive training. I'm proud that I have been a pain control specialist for the past 20 years. I work with bona fide pain clinics in just about every district in the state of California. I work with many pain doctors that take care of the most sick people that through conventional medicine cannot get pain relief. So what is it that I do? I formulate cocktails that have narcotics, cocktails that have antispasmodics, cocktails that have sedatives, that in some cases are made 500 times the strengths that you can commercially buy in the United States to give people the palliative care that in many cases, in most cases, will ameliorate pain. One example is a drug called fentanyl that we make. It is 1,000 times stronger than morphine. But this issue today, my friends, is also a personal issue. 20 years ago tomorrow, I lost my mother, Charlene, from complications of lung cancer that went to liver cancer and breast cancer. And when my mom was diagnosed, she made me promise her one thing. She says, "Jeff, please use your skills to make sure that I don't suffer because I'm scared to death of the pain that I might find myself in." And I made a commitment to my mom that I would ensure that I would use all my knowledge to ensure that she will have as comfortable of a death as possible. I met with her oncologist, and he told me that my mom, as a complication to her cancer, was going to go into a coma because it affected her parathyroid gland, and he wanted to know whether he wanted me to have drugs administered to prevent her from going into a coma. And he told me that he advised me, "You should let your mom go into a coma because she will be free from any pain and suffering." And so my family came together, and we chose not to administer that drug. And we allowed my mom, Charlene, to go into the coma. She was under hospice care, and she had a morphine pump. And that pump was left for us as the family, that if we saw her spasming, if we felt that she was in pain, that we could push that button. And it was made very clear to me that if I wanted to push that button a little bit more than normal, that I could take my mother's life. And I can't tell you how tempted I was to push that button. When I was in pharmacy school, I worked at a pharmacy in Hollywood on Poinsettia and Sunset called Liberty Pharmacy, and I had a mentor, a preceptor. His name was Dr. Jim D. One of the most wonderful educators I ever worked with, who went on to become a physician and then went on to become a psychiatrist and worked in Washington, D.C., and I remember calling my dear friend Jim, the late Jim D., who passed away a few years ago. I want to push that button, and I want to consult with you about that. He said, Jeff, don't push that button. It is not your right to take your mother's life. Only God should be able to do that. You will live with those guilts for the rest of your life. One of my favorite musicians is a gentleman, the late gentleman, named Luther Vandross. And one of my favorite songs in his final album was a song called Dance with My Father Again. After I chose not to push that button, I would spend every wakeful moment that I had being by my mother's side, touching her warm hands, kissing her warm cheeks, and telling her how much that I loved her. I was able to dance with my mother once again. I would not have been able to dance with my mother had I pushed that button. When the Catholic Church Ecumenical on Climate Change was issued, this body embraced it. The Catholic Church has vehemently opposed suicide. In fact, they refer to it as murder. But now it appears that this body is prepared to reject it. When it comes to the death penalty, this legislature, this state cannot even agree on a toxic cocktail for those condemned to death because one of those cocktails may violate the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. It seems hypocritical to me that we can't agree on a formula to execute convicted murderers, but we're prepared to approve a cocktail or a drug to allow sick people to kill themselves. We have approximately 900 people on death row who have murdered, tortured, and raped men and women and children, and they're still alive today. This legislature remains silent and refuses to deliver the capital punishment on these heinous criminals, but we seem obsessed to pass a law that may claim the lives of people who may be convinced by their errors that they may have no other option other than to kill themselves. Believe me, I understand the pain a patient who has been told he or she is going to die because of a terminal illness goes through. As a pharmacist, I have great compassion for those who want to end the suffering that comes with a terminal illness. But what we're being asked to do today is give the government the okay to people diagnosed with terminal illness with 6 months or less to live to kill themselves, even though we all know that sometimes these diagnoses are wrong. Just look what happened to Jeanette Hall of Oregon. In her own words, she writes, I live in Oregon where assisted suicide is legal. In 2000, I was diagnosed with cancer and told I had 6 months to a year to live. I knew that our law had passed. Indeed, I had voted for it, but I didn't know exactly how to go about doing it. I asked my doctor, but he really didn't answer me. On my 3rd visit, he asked me how my son, who was attending the police academy and knew the doctor, and my doctor knew I wouldn't see him, would feel if I went forward with my plan. I didn't know what to say. I agreed to be treated. I had both chemotherapy and radiation, and I'm so happy to be alive. It is now 12 years later. If my doctor had believed in assisted suicide, I would be dead. I thank him and all my doctors for helping me choose life with dignity. Assisted suicide should not be legal. Don't make Oregon's mistakes. Laws against assisted suicide are in place to prevent abuse and to protect people from unscrupulous doctors and greedy benefactors. They are not and have never been intended to make people suffer. And I am assuming that I'm not alone on this floor. Like all of you, I've heard from hundreds of people in my district who support and oppose physician-assisted suicide. The issue is divisive, no question about it. Both sides have valid points, and I believe all of us here today are in a very difficult position. But let's be clear. Some may consider suicide a sin, but it is certainly not a crime. Let me repeat myself. Suicide is not a crime. Anyone in the United States of America can take their life on their own without the government saying they can or they can't do it. Government doesn't have a place when it comes to the most sensitive and critical decisions of our lives that remain private by patients and their families, their clergy, and their God. There are no medical protocols that any physician or pharmacist can guarantee that does not cause pain and suffering. As a medical professional, I would say there is no proof that death is a painless process. What is an aid in dying drug on page 2 of this bill? Who will determine whether the aid in dying drug does not cause pain and suffering? Protocols for assisted suicide may not, as we allege, provide a quick death as it is hoped. Again, another example in Oregon, where physician suicide is legal. Anywhere from 15 to 25% of people that take the drug cocktail fail in their attempt to kill themselves. Can you imagine the experience of family witnessing the suffering of that patient? Is death painless? Well, we don't know the answer to that because nobody's ever been able to come back and tell us. The problem in determining whether a person suffers with any deadly drug that has killed them is that, again, they can't tell us. But let me give you an example, my friends. An adult with a terminal illness can go into any Rite Aid, can go into any CVS, Walgreens, independent pharmacy. They can purchase 100 Benadryl capsules, 25 milligram, formerly on prescription when I first graduated from pharmacy school, a sedating antihistamine. They can go to their local liquor store and buy a 6-pack of beer. They can take the entire bottle of Benadryl, enjoy their beer, and before the 6th beer is drunk, they will have a fatal overdose. A terminal patient receiving OxyContin for their pain can easily take an entire stock bottle prescribed by their doctor with a cocktail of their choice and achieve the same outcome. These results can be just as fatal as one being given pentobarbital, that's the single drug version that's being used maybe in other states, by a prescribing doctor to assist in suicide. But we have no proof that the death resulting from any of these protocols cause any pain or suffering. So if suicide's not illegal, and if people can even go on the internet and find cocktails that are readily available to end their life, why do we really need this law? Healthcare professionals, including physicians and pharmacists, take the Hippocratic Oath. I look to my colleague from Sacramento as I say that. We took this oath because we're here to heal people, and it says in the oath that we do not administer poisons to our patients. There are other problems with the text of this bill. On page 2, and I hope that my attorney friend, my senator from Monterey, will listen to these line numbers because I hope he'll be able to give us the answers to these questions. On page 2, the bill provides immunity to a person from civil or criminal liability solely because he or she was present when the qualified person was present when the qualified individual self-administered a drug. My first question is, where is the reference to Penal Code 401 that makes it a felony to aid and abet a suicide? There's no reference. You're going to have two laws that are going to be competing with each other. Somewhere in the bill, shouldn't it read, notwithstanding, Penal Code 401 shall not apply to this law? On page 6, line 27, it seems this bill conflicts with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The bill says that before a patient has a right to kill him or herself, the patient must possess the physical and mental ability to self-administer the aid in dying drug. What if an ALS patient is paralyzed from the neck down and can't swallow and can't move their arms? Are they prevented from participating in physician-assisted suicide? Page 6, line 40 of the bill states, the individual must make a written request. What about my ALS patient that can't move their arms? How do they write? On page 7, line 23, one of the witnesses can be a blood relative that can, in fact, be an heir to the patient's estate. Isn't that a conflict of interest? It seems this is right for someone who can personally benefit from the suicide to profit from the patient's death. Do we really need another Dateline special on the consequences of this new law? In Oregon, again, Kate Cheney was convinced by her doctor to kill herself. One doctor refused to prescribe the drugs to assist her suicide. Another doctor refused. And finally, Kate's daughter found a doctor who would prescribe the lethal cocktail, and Kate Cheney was convinced to kill herself. What if a patient seeking an aid in dying drug chooses also not to take the drug? If a patient other than who it was prescribed takes the drug to commit a suicide, is there a crime? Is a drug now a weapon that can be used to murder someone else? And who's going to have that liability? Shouldn't there be a provision in this law that ensures the safe return of the aid in dying drug back to the pharmacy for destruction if it is not consumed in a finite period of time? On page 8, line 32, the bill states that the person seeking to take a lethal cocktail did not arise from coercion or undue influence by another person. It's been shown that many sick elders are sensitive to being a burden on their families or loved ones and will not rat out their relatives that could be relieved of the burden in taking care of their loved ones, or may be the beneficiaries of a large life insurance policy or estate if the elder has concerns over the beneficiary's poor finances. According to the Oregon With Death with Dignity annual report, 40% of the people who died by assisted suicide reporting feeling like a burden on their family and caregivers, and said it was the primary reason for requesting the lethal drugs. On page 12, line 6, the declaration reads, I have been fully informed of my diagnosis and prognosis, the nature of the aid in dying drug to be prescribed, and the associated risks. Well, the associated risks. So aside from death, they're admitting that there could be some significant side effects that have been demonstrated in other states when we don't have the protocols that we know can alleviate one's suffering. On page 12, line 11, the declaration continues to state that a desire to end my life in a humane and dignified manner. Can any medical provider guarantee this? It hasn't seemed to work for death row inmates. In conclusion, my friends, this bill, this potential law, will give false hope to anyone that thinks that death can be a painless process. Again, I have great compassion for those in a terrible situation. I've had many patients who have suffered, and there are many ways to ease their pain. What I can't support is a law that encourages these people to use the government as an excuse to kill themselves. I just can't in good conscience support a law that promotes suicide. My friend from San Francisco claims that we got to get the hands of government out of this issue. I would argue we are having blood on our hands by making this into the government arena. And for these reasons, in honor of my deceased mother, I respectfully ask for your no vote.
Thank you. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Madam President and colleagues. I stand here proudly as well as a co-author of this bill. This is a measure that actually, before our good friend Assemblymember Berg brought this to this legislature, Assemblymember Aroner brought this bill. In fact, it was my first year in the California Assembly back in 1999. It was the first bill I co-authored. It was a bill that I co-authored in part because it is almost now 28 years since my own mother was going through her last illness. She had acute myelogenous leukemia, which is basically a death sentence. And indeed, at the very end of her life, she asked only for two things. She asked that she not die alone and that she die with her dignity. Now, the first we could do without any problem. And as she passed out of this life to whatever, the family was there holding her hand and giving her that comfort. But when it came to her ability to die with her dignity, she couldn't go out at that point in her life and buy a six-pack of beer and 100 Benadryl capsules. She was in the hospital. She was suffering from enormous numbers of white blood cells, which is what this disease is, that would take her life. She was in excruciating pain, and the morphine drips certainly help. But her dignity, she wanted to die with her dignity. And we are here today on the precipice of granting a wish that I was not able to give to my mother, but perhaps my children will be able to give to me at some point, hopefully far down the road. But actually, one never knows, do we? Because the only thing we know in this life is that someday we are going to die. It is part of the process. And the question becomes, who is going to decide how we die? I've heard some of my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues, whom I respect deeply, tell us that it is God's decision. Well, that isn't my God's decision. And shouldn't we all be able to worship God in our own way? You know, I think we do ultimately worship the same God, but we worship that God in different ways. My God wants me to be able to make that decision. And so when we talk about that issue, it really isn't something for the government to decide. And I agree with my colleagues that it really isn't government's role, nor is it our role on this floor to tell other people how they should believe and worship their God and what their God sees for them when they go through the inevitability of taking their last breath. So let's leave government out of that. Let us not sit here and make that choice for anyone else. That then leads us to the only other reason that this issue should be before us, and that is our responsibility to protect others from the dastardly deeds or the evil deeds of other people. And this bill indeed does just that. This bill says that it is the individual themselves who have to be the ones to self-medicate. They have got to decide after talking with several people, several medical providers. They have to talk with them several times. Now, the beauty of all this is that we, as a legislative body, should, in fact, protect people so that when they do make their choices, they are making them freely. They are making them without coercion. And that's what this bill does. And that is the only role we should play in this discussion. So I submit that we are talking about end-of-life decisions. We are talking about people who are in excruciating pain. We are talking about people for whom the diagnosis is one that will happen. We are talking about giving people a choice. We are not saying they have to take the medication. Indeed, I think what is very interesting with the statistics they have in different states is that most people don't take the medications. But they are there just in case. They are there if the person decides they have had enough, that they want to end their suffering, that they want to be able to transition out of this life with their dignity. And I think it is our responsibility to give people that choice, to give them that freedom. Because at the end of the day, we will all end up in the same situation. Are we as a legislature going to make that decision for people? Or are we truly going to take government out of the process and let every individual decide, to the extent they can, how and when they are done with the pain and the suffering and want to let it go? And with that, in honor of Enid Rosen Jackson, I ask for your aye vote.
Senator Anderson.
I have a question of the co-floor managers. If they're willing to accept a question.
Senator Anderson has a question of the floor managers. Do you both accept? And let's make it an actual question. Senator Anderson, proceed.
I think I'm capable of doing that. You don't have to tell me. Is there any provision in the bill that provides for a witness to witness the actual taking of the drug? Or is the person alone, or is the person able to take it alone without a witness?
Yes, the person is. Once the prescription is given, as the prescription is being given and written by the attending physician, there are a number of things that are discussed with the person, including many, many things. When the prescription is written and filled, then the only thing that remains is within 48 hours, the person has to attest that they are taking this medicine without coercion, and they need to sign that. And then it is left to the person to decide how and in what circumstance they wish, if they wish, and at least a third change their minds, how they will leave, how they will die.
Do you have another question?
No, I didn't know. I want to give Senator, my good friend, the Senator Attorney, and I don't remember his district, Monterey. I didn't know if he wanted to respond. I'm happy with the answer, but if you'd like to add.
Thank you for asking. I concur with my joint author.
Thank you very much. We've heard a lot today on the floor, and I think that some people are going to follow their heart in one direction or another. I think there are some basics, elements that we all agree on, those who support this bill and those who oppose this bill. And I think one of the concerns that has really stuck with me is the protections for seniors and developmentally disabled and disabled in general. We had a retired sergeant inspector from the San Francisco Police Department who's come here numerous times at the request of senators to testify as an expert witness. And his job was, I want to make sure I have this correct. His job was to run the department an elder abuse task force. And he did that for 20 years. And he sent a very compelling letter. And he laid out that the legislation effectively paints a target on the back of each and every elderly and disabled person in our state. And the promises and assurances of the safeguards and protections from the representatives of those in favor are based in innocent ignorance and misrepresentation. And he goes on to lay out case after case of how people have been abused, how seniors have been abused. And his concern is if there's not a witness in the room that a nefarious person, whether a relative or other, could take advantage of the system, because once they get that pill, there's no going back. While they may feel better and not choose to use the pill at that time, the pill could be administered to them because, one, it's water soluble, or two, alcohol soluble. And that pill could be administered against their will. And his thought was, if some witness had to be there, there would be an assurance that they would not be abused and taken advantage of. And we know time after time that money can move people to do evil things. And maybe in their heart of hearts, they're thinking they're helping that senior by pushing that button the extra time. But I think the intent of this bill is to allow the patient to make that choice, not someone else. You know, I've heard about the polling, and I was concerned, you know, in my district that perhaps I was out of line with those folks that I spoke to. And I went throughout my district when this was SB 128, and I collected signatures on where people stood on it. And when I talked to them, they'd say, oh, absolutely, they should control their own destiny. And I said, well, if you knew that a witness didn't have to be there, that the drug could be applied nefariously, would you still be supportive? And they said, oh, absolutely not. When I said, if you knew that those drugs were found unfit for prisoners on death row, would you be supportive? And they said, absolutely not. When I said, Oregon's taught us that not everybody dies a peaceful death, and that sometimes, while taking the drugs, they regurgitate them, and it sends them into a coma for a much lengthier death. And in some cases, it has other horrible outcomes. I said, what do you think about that? And the answer was overwhelmingly no. The other issue is, I said, well, what really is the crux of why you would want this to start with? And invariably, it was about pain. Nobody wants to suffer, and they shouldn't suffer, and they don't need to suffer. And we've heard compelling cases. I have my own case, and I'm not going to go over my testimony on the floor the last time a bill similar to this was on the floor, SB 128. And I told my case and how it meant to me personally. But I think we make a huge mistake when we compare yesterday's medicines to today's miracle therapies. You know, we're talking about losing family members 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You know how far we've come? We didn't have a cell phone back then. We didn't have any of these miracle drugs. We didn't have any of this stuff. And yet that's the comparison we're going through, because that's what we recollect. And of course, 30 years ago, we didn't have the pain meds, as our friend pharmacist from Riverside had talked about. And now we have these powerful medications that nobody should die suffering and pain. And I think that changes the equation just a bit. So I reject that we compare yesterday's medicine with today's miracle therapies. And I would encourage you to work on this bill some more, so that this bill wouldn't encourage those who would prey on our seniors and our disabled. I think they deserve better from us. I understand the goal you're shooting for, and I'll be frank with you, I will never support it, but I understand what you're trying to achieve, and I want to encourage you to be the very best that you can be and achieve that goal and not put seniors and disabled at risk. I urge a no vote.
Any further discussion or debate? Any further discussion or debate? Seeing none, Senator Monning, you will close first, and then we'll go to the co-jockey, Senator Wilk. Senator Monning.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to present this historic and indeed landmark legislation. I want to offer a couple of comments in response to my colleagues with doubts or concerns The beauty of our process is that you have the right to vote no today, and you've had the right to express your concerns. Many of them have been personal. Some have been based on religious belief or moral interpretation. And this institution respects that, and the votes will reflect that. I do feel it's important to correct a couple of inaccuracies in presentation. The term physician-assisted suicide, or that this is suicide, that's been discounted by the American Psychiatric Association. Suicide is an irrational act of somebody taking their life in desperation. End of life, aid in dying, is understanding that in the dying process, different people die in different ways. This bill addresses a very limited universe, people with a terminal illness with less than 6 months to live. But it addresses an even more limited universe, those who seek to consider this as a possible option. I can assure you that the joint and co-authors on this bill have worked with opponents from religious institutions to disability rights groups and have endeavored to build in protections in this law that are stronger than the protections in any of the states where this has been practiced, and this has been practiced in a manner that has been embraced by members of the medical community, not all. This legislation prompted a very robust discussion among members of the California Medical Association, who made their own historic choice to move from opposition to neutrality because they recognized that the Hippocratic Oath has also evolved, and today's modern interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath, as defined by the American Medical Association, is not just do no harm, it's also to relieve pain and suffering. That is every much a part of a conscious, responsible physician today as doing no harm. But our bill requires no physician to participate. It requires no pharmacist to participate. If it offends their belief system, if it offends their belief on whether or not they think this is a good idea. It absolutely mandates no patient to participate. The strength of this legislation is the empowerment of an individual in consultation with 2 separate physicians, and if necessary, psychiatric consultation as defined in the Act, to be determined eligible for consideration. And that's that relationship between physician and patient, not to be interfered by government, but subject to the strict guidelines and protections that we as a body have the responsibility, and I would say the opportunity and ability to enact. I would encourage everyone who is concerned about the contents of this legislation to read it cover to cover. You will see that it has protections to protect the elderly, the infirm, and it's not available to somebody who is not capable of sound decision-making capacity or the ability to self-ingest. So, Madam President and colleagues, I will conclude my close by recognizing the many people who have brought this legislation to the point where it is today, to the point where we've acknowledged today the horror of September 11th, where over 3,000 Americans died in crimes of violence, where in 1973 in Chile on this same date, thousands died in the overthrow of a democratically elected government. So this date conjures images of violence and horror. We have the opportunity today to also add to that list of September 11th, one that honors compassion and the ability of a family to join hands, as Brittany Maynard's family did, but they had to move to Oregon, to join hands, to share goodbyes, to share I love you, and to share tears and laughter, and to leave a lasting memory and testimony to the life of Brittany Maynard of that loving, compassionate goodbye and humane transition. Compare that to the transition of Emily Rose Olvera, or the transition of Jennifer Glass, who testified here in our first press conference and who passed a couple of weeks ago. Many have suggested today, members, that palliative care under modern medicine is the solution. There's no need to suffer. Well, Jennifer Glass was the beneficiary of palliative care, and during that induced coma, her body started to die from dehydration and starvation, and yet she woke up horrified, complaining that she was drowning in the liquid in her lungs and was suffocating and was begging for help. That is not palliative care void of pain or suffering. She sought this choice in her life, and my colleague from San Francisco shared her very powerful quote. We're joined today by the memory and legacy of those who committed their remaining days to try to establish this right, not for themselves because they knew their time was running out, but for others. I mentioned Jennifer Glass, Emily Rose Olvera. Just this week, we lost Herb Orban, who sought a compassionate transition. We're joined today by Christy O'Donnell, who some of you heard in the Health Committee, served the LAPD as a sergeant, served us as an attorney who's represented people with disabilities, and Elizabeth Wallner from Sacramento, who's with us today. They join us today to join in the appeal, and they represent the crest of a wave of Californians, over 75% of now who support this compassionate option. Members, this option does not denigrate the sanctity of life or the reverence for life. This compassionate option honors the sanctity of life and the power of the life of somebody who's been dealt the cards of a terminal illness that they did not choose for themselves or their families. We should not stand in the way of a person dealt that certainty of a death by means of which they did not choose, to not have the option to make that pain-free, compassionate, and inclusive of loving family members who can carry a memory of a loved one saying goodbye and I love you, or the memory of somebody driven through the horror of their terminal illness to resort to a gun or some other form of death that leaves an impression on the lives of loved ones forever. Members, I defer for our final close to my good friend and colleague from Yolo County, from Davis, and I thank all of you for this opportunity today as we make history and establish September 11th not only as a day of horror and violence, but as a day of compassion and choice. Thank you.